On the damp morning of April 18th, 1983, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 73-year-old Ruth Miller knelt beside a weathered compost pile behind her red bank barn, while a cold drizzle soaked the shoulders of her faded denim jacket. She ran both hands through the dark, steaming heap, feeling every handful instead of seeing it, because blindness had claimed her sight 12 years earlier. Across the gravel lane, a county agricultural inspector stood with folded arms beside his pickup, wondering why an elderly blind woman kept hauling spoiled hay, kitchen scraps, and livestock manure onto the same exhausted field everyone else had already written off. By every modern recommendation, that worn patch of soil had stopped paying for itself years before. Yet Ruth simply smiled, lifted another bucket, and carried it toward the waiting earth without hurrying once. Most people in Paradise Township remembered Ruth from years before glaucoma stole her eyesight. She had always spoken softly, walked carefully, and listened longer than she talked. Her hands told stories that her face never tried to tell. Thick fingers curved from decades of gripping shovel handles, tightening fence wire, and guiding horses before tractors became common on neighboring farms. Even after darkness settled permanently across her world in 1971, she refused to leave the 112 acres she and her late husband, Samuel, had purchased in March 1946 for $14,600 after returning from the war. Neighbors admired her determination at first. Admiration slowly turned into pity. Pity eventually became quiet laughter whenever someone spotted her carrying another load of rotting compost across the same neglected field behind the orchard. Let me tell you about Ruth Miller. She never believed that good soil was something you bought from a dealer or spread from a shiny plastic bag. She believed healthy ground remembered every kindness and every mistake. Samuel had taught her that during their first spring together, kneeling beside a handful of earth instead of reading instructions from a booklet. He often said that the richest harvest began long before the first seed touched daylight. Ruth repeated those words so often that even after Samuel died from a heart attack in November 1978, they sounded less like memories than instructions. The heart of the farm rested inside an aging machine shed that smelled of grease, oak boards, and old seasons. Parked beneath a faded canvas cover waited a 1952 Allis-Chalmers WD45, rated at roughly 43 drawbar horsepower, purchased new by Samuel in August 1953 for $2,300 from a dealer in nearby New Holland. Every oil change had been written inside a small notebook wrapped in wax paper. Every grease fitting received attention, every 50 operating hours without exception. Samuel used to wipe the hood clean before parking it, saying machines work hardest for owners who respected them after the engine cooled. Ruth could not see the orange paint anymore, yet every morning she rested her palm on the tractor's hood before beginning work, recognizing each dent like familiar handwriting. The younger farmers rarely understood that ritual. They saw an outdated tractor and an aging widow refusing to accept progress. New diesel machines with enclosed cabs, better hydraulics, and larger implements worked surrounding farms. Their owners finished planting twice as quickly. Ruth never argued with those facts. She simply continued using what she had because she trusted careful timing more than impressive speed. One person found her especially difficult to understand. 36-year-old Daniel Harper had recently become Lancaster County's newest agricultural extension advisor after graduating from Penn State and building a reputation for improving crop yields with modern recommendations. His reports were filled with precise measurements, fertilizer schedules, and laboratory analyses. He believed strongly in science because science had solved countless farming problems. Yet, whenever he reviewed Ruth's records, nothing made sense. Instead of purchasing commercial fertilizer for her depleted field, she collected spoiled silage from neighboring dairies, leaves from church grounds, stable bedding, wood ash from old stoves, and vegetable scraps from local markets. She piled everything together, turned it patiently, waited months, then spread it by hand before using the old Allis-Chalmers to work it gently into the earth. Daniel respected hard work. He simply believed Ruth was wasting hers. Late that afternoon, he watched her stop beside the compost pile, lower one knee into mud, and scoop up another handful. She rubbed it slowly between her fingers before smiling to herself. "What are you feeling?" Daniel finally asked. "Tomorrow," Ruth answered. The reply lingered longer than either expected. Have you ever known someone who could notice something everyone else walked straight past? Someone who trusted experience so completely that doubt from a dozen voices never seemed loud enough to shake it? Ruth carried herself with exactly that quiet certainty, and somehow it unsettled people more than anger ever could. The next Saturday, word spread that Ruth intended to haul another full wagon load of rotten compost across the abandoned field in broad daylight, just as the monthly farmers' market filled with neighbors. By noon, more people than she realized had gathered along the fence, and Daniel stepped forward with a smile that suggested he was finally ready to say what everyone else had only whispered until Ruth set down her shovel, turned toward the voices, and waited. Daniel rested one boot on the lower rail of the fence and glanced at the gathering crowd before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. The farmers lining the lane had come to buy seed, trade parts, and exchange stories. Yet now every conversation drifted toward a blind widow with another wagon of steaming compost. The smell rolled across the field with a warm breeze, drawing wrinkled noses and amused smiles. Ruth stood quietly beside the wooden spreader, one hand resting on its worn sideboard while the other lightly touched the hitch of her faithful Allis-Chalmers WD45, as though the machine itself were introducing her to the morning. Mrs. Miller, Daniel called politely. You spent nearly 3 years feeding that field with compost. Laboratory tests still show low productivity. Why keep hauling waste where it clearly isn't working? The question sounded reasonable. Nobody objected. Ruth tilted her head toward his voice before answering, because the field isn't finished speaking. Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel smiled, though the smile carried more confidence than curiosity. Soil doesn't speak. No, Ruth replied gently. People just forget how to listen. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. One chuckle became several, then dozens. An equipment dealer slapped his knee. A younger farmer removed his cap to wipe tears from laughing eyes. Someone in the back muttered that blindness must have reached her judgment long before it reached her eyesight. Even Daniel laughed, not cruelly at first, but with the comfortable certainty of a man convinced that facts had already settled the argument. His laugh grew louder as others joined him until it echoed across the pasture. Ruth never reacted. She did not tighten her jaw. She did not defend herself. She simply brushed a little compost from her sleeve, reached for the wagon handle, and continued unloading another forkful onto the waiting ground. The laughter slowly faded because there was nothing for it to fight against. Silence, it turned out, was heavier than mockery. Let me tell you about Daniel Harper. He had grown up on a dairy farm outside Center County, Pennsylvania, where drought and debt nearly forced his parents to sell everything in 1976. New fertilizer programs, improved seed varieties, and careful soil testing helped save that farm. Those experiences shaped him into a man who trusted measurable results above inherited wisdom. He was not arrogant by nature. He simply believed progress came from replacing tradition whenever evidence demanded it. Standing before Ruth, he honestly thought he was protecting an elderly woman from wasting precious time and money. After the crowd dispersed, Daniel walked beside Ruth as she loaded empty buckets into the wagon. I hope you know I wasn't trying to embarrass you, he said. I know. You could improve yields faster with commercial fertilizer. I probably could. The answer surprised him. Then why don't you? Ruth smiled. Because I'm not trying to grow crops this year. Daniel frowned. What are you trying to grow? Soil. The single word settled over him, without explanation. That evening, Daniel drove back to his office, carrying more questions than when he had arrived. He opened county aerial photographs dating back to the early 1950s. The Miller property caught his attention immediately. Every surrounding field showed consistent production over the decades. Only the western parcel behind Ruth's orchard steadily declined after repeated tobacco and corn rotations through the late 1960s. Years of heavy cultivation had stripped away organic matter until the earth became compacted and lifeless. The reports explained what had happened. They did not explain Ruth. Let me tell you about compost, because it is often misunderstood. Fresh manure alone is not magic, and neither are piles of leaves or spoiled hay. Compost works because countless bacteria, fungi, insects, and microscopic organisms slowly transform waste into stable organic matter. That living material improves soil structure, helps sandy ground retain moisture, loosens heavy clay, and feeds crops gradually instead of flooding them with nutrients all at once. The process demands patience because nature refuses to hurry. You cannot negotiate with decomposition. You can only create the right conditions and wait. That lesson frustrated people who measured success by weeks instead of seasons. The following Monday, Daniel requested fresh soil samples from Ruth's neglected field. He marked 12 collection points using survey flags and sent every sample to the Pennsylvania State University Agricultural Analytical Laboratory. While waiting for the results, he visited neighboring farms that bordered the Miller property. Each conversation sounded strangely similar. Samuel always said that field would recover. Ruth knows dirt better than anyone. She listens more than she talks. No one claimed the field would produce record harvests. Yet, nobody questioned Ruth's honesty. Back on her farm, Ruth followed the same routine she had repeated for years. Before sunrise, she walked carefully to the machine shed, rested both hands on the hood of the WD45, checked the engine oil by touch, and started the four-cylinder gasoline engine. Its familiar rumble rolled across the valley. She spread another measured layer of finished compost, never thicker than 3 inches, then worked it lightly into the surface instead of burying it deeply. She believed soil breathed best when treated gently. Have you ever owned something everyone else dismissed as worthless, yet you kept caring for it because you understood its value better than anyone else? Sometimes the greatest test is not repairing what is broken. Sometimes it is enduring the voices insisting that repair is impossible. 3 weeks later, the laboratory envelope finally arrived on Daniel's desk. He unfolded the report expecting confirmation that Ruth's methods had accomplished very little. Instead, one unexpected number forced him to read every page twice before he reached for his truck keys without saying a word. Daniel drove the 12 miles from his office to the Miller farm faster than he ever admitted afterward. The laboratory report rested on the passenger seat, folded and unfolded so many times that its corners had begun to curl. Every figure had been checked twice by the analysts in State College because they believed an error had slipped into the first calculation. None had. The western field that everyone considered exhausted had gained nearly 2% organic matter since Ruth began her compost program. Water infiltration had improved dramatically. Soil compaction had fallen. Earthworm activity, once almost non-existent, had multiplied across every sampling location. The field had not merely survived. It had begun rebuilding itself from the inside. He found Ruth repairing a loose chain on the manure spreader. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said before greeting her. She smiled without looking up. "Not yet." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "You've learned something." She tightened the final link. "Understanding it takes longer." Daniel handed her the report anyway. She could not read it, but she rested her fingertips lightly across the folded pages, as though feeling the weight of the news instead of the words. "Tell me." He read every measurement aloud. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she nodded once. "The field finally believes me." Daniel laughed softly, but this time there was no mockery hiding beneath the sound. There was respect. The weeks that followed brought warm rains across Lancaster County. By late May 1983, Ruth planted open-pollinated Reed's yellow dent corn across the restored acreage using an old 2-row planter Samuel had rebuilt during the winter of 1964. The wooden seed boxes had been replaced once, the steel discs twice, yet the frame remained straight because Samuel insisted on cleaning every barren before storing it each autumn. Modern planters cover more acres in a day, but this one placed each seed with dependable precision. Ruth measured progress by consistency instead of speed. Daniel visited almost every week. At first, he came carrying notebooks. Soon he came carrying questions. He watched Ruth walk slowly across the rows, tapping the ground gently with a cane while pausing every few yards to crumble soil between her fingers. "What tells you the moisture is right?" he asked. "The temperature. You can feel that." The soil speaks through more than one language. Daniel stopped writing. He started paying attention. "Let me tell you about patience, because farming has always rewarded people who understand its true meaning. Patience is not waiting without purpose. It is working faithfully while results remain invisible. Ruth had spent 3 years rebuilding a field that produced almost nothing because she believed healthy harvests begin where no one bothers to look. Roots, microbes, moisture, structure, those things never appear in newspaper headlines. Yet they decide whether prosperity lasts 1 season or 50. The loudest victories often grow from the quietest habits. By July, the corn reached shoulder height. Neighbors slowed their trucks while passing the Miller farm. Some blamed favorable rainfall. Others credited improved seed. Few mentioned compost anymore. The green stalks answered arguments better than words. Daniel noticed something else during one afternoon inspection. Every section receiving Ruth's finished compost showed stronger root development than adjacent comparison plots established for county observation. When he gently pulled one sample plant, thick white roots reached deeper into loose, dark soil instead of spreading shallowly beneath the surface. He replaced the plant immediately. "You don't like pulling them," Ruth observed. "It feels disrespectful." She smiled. "Now you're beginning to sound like Samuel." The remark stayed with him. Later that week, Daniel organized a voluntary field walk for local producers. Nearly 40 farmers accepted the invitation, including several who had laughed openly at Ruth during the market gathering. They examined soil cores, measured plant height, and compared moisture levels after a week without rain. One farmer finally asked the question everyone carried. "Mrs. Miller, when did you know this would work?" She rested both hands upon the worn fender of the WD-45 before answering. "I never knew." The group looked surprised. "I only believed." Silence settled again. This silence differed from the one that followed the laughter months earlier. That silence carried embarrassment. This one carried reflection. Let me tell you about the old Allis-Chalmers standing beside her. Many people admire horsepower numbers without understanding why certain tractors earned lifelong loyalty. The WD-45 delivered dependable low-end torque through a long-stroke 4-cylinder engine and straightforward gearing. Horsepower tells you how quickly work can be done. Torque tells you how stubbornly a machine keeps pulling when the load becomes heavy. That is why older cast-iron tractors often seem stronger than their specifications suggested. Their engines sacrifice speed for steady pulling power, and farmers value reliability more than impressive advertisements. Samuel trusted that tractor because it never quit halfway through a difficult job. Ruth trusted it because neither had she. August arrived with clear skies and warm nights. The ears filled evenly. Kernel rows stretched nearly to the tips. County yield estimates predicted the Miller field would produce almost 140 bushels per acre, more than double its average from the previous decade. Daniel stood at the edge of the field one evening watching sunlight settle across thousands of healthy stalks. "I laughed at you," he admitted quietly. "You did. I was certain. I know. I've never been happier to be wrong." Ruth reached down and picked up a handful of dark soil. She placed it carefully into his open palm. "Then promise me something. Anything. When people praise the harvest." She closed his fingers around the earth. "Make sure they remember what happened long before anyone could see it." Daniel looked across the field, understanding those words more deeply than any laboratory report could have taught him. Days later, the combines gathered outside the Miller farm, and before the first row disappeared beneath the header, a black sedan bearing the seal of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture rolled slowly into the lane. The black sedan stopped beside the weathered mailbox just as the first combine eased toward the edge of Ruth Miller's restored field. Two officials from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture stepped out, carrying clipboards instead of cameras. They had not arrived to celebrate. They had come to verify reports that seemed almost impossible. County records showed one of Lancaster County's poorest performing fields had become one of its healthiest examples of soil recovery without relying on expensive commercial programs. The numbers demanded proof. Ruth stood quietly beside the old Allis-Chalmers WD45 with one hand resting on its warm hood. Daniel Harper walked toward the visitors and handed them copies of every laboratory report, every field observation, every rainfall record, and every yield estimate collected throughout the season. One official studied the papers before looking across the corn. "Is this really the same field?" "It is," Daniel answered. "What changed?" Daniel glanced toward Ruth before speaking. "We stopped trying to force the soil to perform. The harvest began. The combine swallowed the first rows with its familiar rhythm, while a waiting grain wagon rolled beside it. Moisture readings averaged just under 16%, nearly ideal for storage after limited drying. As each wagon reached the portable scale, neighbors gathered closer. Nobody spoke very much. Numbers carried enough weight on their own. The first weight exceeded expectations. The second confirmed it. The third erased every remaining doubt. When the final calculations were finished, the restored field averaged 143 bushels of corn per acre. It did not break county records, nor did Ruth expect it to. That had never been her purpose. What mattered was where the field had started and what patient stewardship had accomplished. Land that many believed had reached the end of its usefulness had become productive again without abandoning the principles Samuel had trusted decades earlier. One of the officials walked slowly toward Ruth. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "we've spent years encouraging farmers to improve soil conservation. You accomplished something remarkable." Ruth smiled. "The soil accomplished it. You deserve the credit." "No." She gently patted the tractor's fender. "Samuel taught me. The earth did the rest." Daniel watched that exchange with quiet admiration. Months earlier, he would have listed nutrient percentages, organic matter, and rainfall totals before mentioning faith or patience. Now he understood those measurements described only part of the story. The invisible decisions made year after year had mattered just as much as the visible harvest. Within weeks, neighboring farmers began asking Ruth for advice instead of offering it. She welcomed every visitor exactly the same way. She never criticized modern methods. She never claimed compost solved every agricultural problem. Instead, she encouraged people to understand their own land before reaching for quick answers. Daniel often accompanied those conversations, translating laboratory science into practical language, while Ruth translated decades of observation into wisdom that could not be measured with instruments. Let me tell you about humility. It rarely arrives at the beginning of success. More often, it appears after certainty has been proven incomplete. Daniel did not become a different man because Ruth embarrassed him. He changed because she refused to embarrass him in return. Every opportunity for revenge passed quietly by. Every apology received genuine grace. That generosity transformed respect into friendship, and friendship became a harvest neither of them expected when they first met beside that steaming compost pile. 5 years passed. By the autumn of 1988, Daniel had rewritten several county educational programs to include long-term soil restoration alongside modern fertility management. During every workshop, he shared the Miller farm as an example, never as a miracle, but as evidence that patient improvement often outlasted fashionable solutions. Younger producers listened because the data supported every claim. Older farmers listened because the story sounded familiar. Ruth continued farming until age 79. Her eyesight never returned. Her confidence never faded. Each spring, she rested her hands on the hood of the WD45 before starting its dependable engine. Children from neighboring farms often asked why she always touched the tractor first. "It carried memories before it carried me," she would answer. In January 1992, Ruth passed away peacefully in her farmhouse after a brief illness, surrounded by family, with Samuel's old maintenance notebook resting on the bedside table. According to her wishes, the farm passed to her daughter, Martha, who continued caring for the land without dividing or selling it. The compost piles remained behind the barn. The western field remained among the healthiest on the property. The Allis-Chalmers WD45 remained there too. Its orange paint had faded further. Its seat had been replaced. Its engine had been rebuilt once after 40 years of faithful work. Yet every autumn it still pulled wagons through the same fields where laughter had once echoed louder than understanding. Daniel attended Ruth's funeral, carrying a small glass jar filled with dark soil from the restored field. He placed it beside the flowers without saying a word. Martha understood immediately. Years later, local schools occasionally brought agricultural students to the Miller farm. They examined soil profiles, studied composting methods, and listened as Daniel, now one of the county's most respected advisors, told the story of the blind farmer who taught him that observation begins long before eyesight. He always ended the tour beside the old tractor. He would rest one hand on the WD-45 and smile. I came here believing I had all the answers, he admitted. I left knowing the better questions. Visitors usually looked across the fields in thoughtful silence. They noticed the earthworms beneath the mulch. They noticed the rich smell of healthy soil. They noticed the old machine waiting patiently inside the shed. Most importantly, they noticed that wisdom sometimes walks more slowly than progress, yet somehow arrives exactly where it is needed. Some things do not flourish because people rush them. They flourish because someone cares for them long enough to let time finish the work. If you've ever been laughed at for believing in something others dismissed, or if someone in your life quietly proved everyone wrong through patience instead of pride, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. I read them because they remind me that fields are not the only things worth restoring. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who saved forgotten 1949 Oliver 88 from a scrapyard before it transformed an entire community's harvest, I hope you'll join me for that story too.